In a dark and secret laboratory at the end of the Unification Wars, the Emperor perfected his greatest super soldiers using his own DNA and power from the warp itself. Stolen by the gods of chaos and deposited on planets across the galaxy, each boy would grow into a ferocious and powerful warlord. Today we are going to show you the very beginning of these 18 demigods, their childhoods, their temperament, and their history up until the looming civil war that would lead to their downfalls. And we are going to start with how they were created. Sometime during M29, the Emperor looked around at his army of Thunder Warriors and decided it was time to up his game. The Thunder Warriors were genetically enhanced super soldiers, but they were batch-made, hyper-aggressive, and prone to going a little insane. Big E might have been a genius god-tier psyker, but he didn't exactly have expert knowledge of genetic engineering. He needed help to design a better soldier. Enter Ammar Astartes. Having grown up on Terra during the Age of Strife, surviving by using her intellect for various warlords, Astartes had already been experimenting with ancient technology in order to create super soldiers, making her exactly the type of scientist needed to create the next generation of superhuman crusaders. Astartes and the Emperor built a plan for a group of near-immortal post-human warriors led by 20 supreme generals, beings that would be second in power only to the Emperor himself and would act not only as an extension of the Emperor, but also the genetic template for a new breed of soldier, the Space Marines. They named these generals Primarchs after the generals of the Thunder Warriors and coded the whole endeavor as the Astartes program. Setting up in a secret laboratory under the Himalayan mountain range, which would eventually be built up into the imposing Imperial Palace years later, the Emperor's biotechnical division got to work taking genetic material from the Emperor and another perpetual named Erda to begin the incubation of 20 bouncing baby warlords. But it was here that everything started to fall apart. You see, the master of mankind was not content with his perfect children just having his DNA. Maybe his previous efforts to have children hadn't worked too well, or maybe he had a new thing he wanted to try, but the Emperor managed to find a portal into the warp and made a deal with the dark gods of chaos for the knowledge needed to infuse his Primarchs with special powers, a deal which he promptly reneged on. Naturally, the Chaos Gods were displeased, and with the use of some time travel shenanigans, they managed to get the Geller field protecting the infants in their pods disabled and scattered the children across the stars. The jury is still out on whether the Emperor planned this as well in order to give his sons varied childhood experiences, but given how much this set him back, it's doubtful. Without the Primarchs, the legions of new Space Marines had to be created with immature DNA that had been collected from each Primarch before they had been stolen, and it resulted in weaker Marines until each legion was reunited with their Primarch fathers and their genetic code could be stabilized. This setback caused Ammar Astartes to despair, believing the whole project to be doomed. She helped plan the infamous palace coup and used the distraction to destroy her notes on the creation of the Primarchs to stop the creation of any more before being killed by the Emperor's forces. And that finally brings us to the beginning of the Great Crusade, as the Emperor took his new Space Marines into the galaxy to create his new Imperium and to find each of the lost Primarchs. Let's begin with the first of them to be found. No, we are not just memeing here, saying the Primarch named Alpharius was the first to be found. It's actually what happened, we think. The problem with the father of the 20th Legion is that there's not much known about him, and what we do know is likely either a lie, a trick, or both. But even though the Imperial histories declared that the first Primarch found was Horus, there is a secret record that states Alpharius was recovered first, his pod landing on Terra itself, and he was kept a secret by the Emperor in order for him and his legion to act as spies unhindered for the entirety of the Great Crusade. Assuming this is true, it also makes a lot of sense. Alpharius is the spy. He was pragmatic, thoughtful, independent, and was a very creative thinker when it came to his approach to combat. Even his physicality helped him to muddy the waters, as he was one of the smallest of the Primarchs, while the Marines of his legion, the Alpha Legion, were typically larger than other Marines. This allowed Alpharius to masquerade as just another Alpha Legionnaire, and vice versa. I am Alpharius became a common thing to hear whenever an outsider asked anyone from this legion who they were. Alpharius lied like it was breathing. What he said in one place was immediately undone by something he said in another, and a big part of that included his name, Alpharius Omegon, which in itself hinted at his greatest secret. Alpharius was not one person, he was two. By some quirk of the transportation method from the Emperor's cloning lab, the Primarch that would become Alpharius Omegon was split into two bodies sharing one soul. However, in keeping with the theme of this enigmatic Primarch, we will be saving the rest of their story for the very end when official records say they were discovered. The Emperor's favorite son, Horus, was officially the first to be found when the Chaos Gods scattered the Primarchs in their pods. The one carrying the boy who would become Horus Lupercal landed on the world of Chthoniya, which was luckily quite close to the Sol system where Holy Terra was. Being so close, Chthoniya had been settled since the dawn of humanity's interplanetary expansion, and so it was a blasted and ruined place, completely taken over by industry and mined nearly hollow by millennia of resource extraction. The people living there were organized into gangs, with constant warfare over dwindling resources being the norm. It was one of these gangs that found the infant Horus and took him in, raising him to be audacious, opportunistic, cunning, and above all else, hungry for approval. Unlike most of his brothers, Horus did not grow into his Primarch abilities immediately. He spent most of his time on Chthoniya trying to earn his name in the constant skirmishes his gang engaged in. Then, rediscovery. After a brief skirmish with Mechanicum tech priests, Horus was identified as the first of the lost Primarchs and immediately sent to Terra, and it was here that Horus really came into his own. As the first of the Emperor's sons to be found, the Master of Mankind spent a lot of time with the young Primarch. Horus was trained in the ways of war and given his very own legion of Space Marines to lead, the 16th, the Luna Wolves. Like every other legion, this one was created using the genetic template of a specific Primarch, making them uniquely able to interface with their commander's abilities and quirks. Reunited with his gene sons, Horus rapidly became a peerless general, which was exactly his purpose. Remember, the Primarchs were manufactured beings designed by the Emperor to fit certain niche roles in his grand plan. Each of them was an experiment to create beings that excel at a particular slice of empire building. We don't have a lot of evidence for what the Emperor was planning for most of his sons, but either through design or through training, Horus became the general, a leader who understood every facet of warfare, who could intuitively plan, react, and improvise to any threat, as well as being a fairly strong combatant in his own right. More importantly, he was the perfect right-hand man. And for over 30 years, this singular general trained and fought by the Emperor's side, gaining a deeper bond with his father than any other Primarch would manage to build. The pair would save each other's life on the battlefield more than once, especially during their wars against the massive Orc Empire of Ulanor, where Horus saved the Emperor from a particularly powerful war boss. So by the time the second Primarch was found on a distant, icy world, Horus was used to being the only son, and his old approval-seeking tendencies from his days as a desperate hive-ganger began to show themselves. His pride and superiority complex were sources of friction between Horus and some of his brothers, especially after he won the title of Warmaster at the conclusion of the Ulanor Crusade, making him the official commander of all Imperial forces, second only to the Emperor himself. But even so, he was still a loyal and good-natured man for the most part. Even his resentment at being abandoned by the Emperor to finish the Great Crusade without him was mostly kept in check, until plans set in motion by his brother Lorgar began to poison his mind and tempt him on the dark path of chaos. But that's a story for another video, so let's turn back the clock to that second Primarch and a lonely, ice-covered planet. That world was called Fenris, a hostile, frozen world home to a handful of tough human communities living similarly to the barbarian tribes of ancient Terra. But the pod carrying our second Primarch did not land close to one of these barbarian villages. No, it landed deep in the unforgiving tundra, with no one around to take in the crying child that emerged from his pod. Well, no human, anyway. The nameless child was instead taken in by a Fenrisian she-wolf, and raised alongside her other pups. Soon the boy was out hunting with them and raiding human settlements. Eventually, they caught the attention of a particularly strong tribe, who hunted the pack down, killed the wolves, and took in the boy. The king of this village saw immediately that something was different about the boy and took him in, naming him Leman of the Russ. From here, Leman grew quickly, mastering human language and the art of combat. He learned camaraderie and became quick to laugh and sing, taking joy where he could, and generally being a chaotic mess of a man, socially speaking at least. But in other areas of his life, it was clear that Leman was more than human. He was a giant of a man who fought whole armies on his own, ripped massive trees out of the ground barehanded, and was able to wrestle gigantic mammoths to the ground, and so it came as no surprise when he made king after his adopted father passed away. It was these stories that finally reached the ears of the Emperor as he was commanding his newly formed Great Crusade, and it brought him to the frigid surface of the icy backwater planet in search of what he knew could only be another of his lost sons. The Emperor came disguised as he often did in new places, and Leman refused to bow to him without challenging him to an eating contest, a drinking contest, and a duel. Leman was a simple man, but the Emperor actually failed the first two, finally succeeding in beating the Wolf King in their duel, which was apparently all Leman actually cared about because he swore loyalty right then and there. And it's a good thing too, as Leman was very special even in comparison to his brothers. Remember what we said about every Primarch being a specific experiment? Well, 3 of them were even more specialized than the others, and Leman was one of those 3. Out of all his brothers, the Wolf King was the strongest, most capable fighter, and that appears to have been by design. When one is building an army of superhuman soldiers led by demigods, it pays to make sure you have at least one of them who is both loyal to a fault and able to beat any of the others. As a fighter, he was vicious, relentless, and willing to do anything, including taking potentially fatal wounds to win. As a general, he was all of these things on a larger scale, his savagery translating to decisive assaults. Wolves go for the throat, and even though Russ proved to be a cunning strategist, every engagement he led ended in a brutal and decisive strike, especially when he was forced to fight his brothers. We're not certain if Leman was made specifically to be the Emperor's executioner, but that is what he became. Only a handful of his brothers could have stood up to him in an even fight, and none of them had his drive. And maybe that's what he was actually made to be, the one Primarch willing to do whatever it took to get the job done. The Emperor knew his enemies in the warp were creatures of pure madness, and fighting them could break even the strong minds of his sons, but not Leman. It could simply be a side effect of that mental fortitude that made Leman the perfect choice for enforcing the Emperor's will, even against the other Primarchs. And it was not a secret either, a fact that likely led to Leman being unpopular with most of his brothers. Horus thought he was an unrefined barbarian, while he and Lionel Johnson outright came to blows. But really, it was the looming specter of who Leman was that seemed to keep the other Primarchs from really making a closer connection with him. Leman Russ was a Primarch killer and had proved it twice. The truth of it is that while Leman Russ would desperately have loved to be friends with the men who were, in name at least, his brothers, it is just too hard to form strong bonds with people who you might be ordered to kill at any moment. It's hard to shake that sort of reputation gained from making the list of your comrades go from 20 to 18. The only thing marking the existence of the Primarch of the Second Legion are an empty statue's plinth and the sad looks shared between Primarchs whenever he is mentioned. Put him out of your thoughts. Official Imperial records show that the next Primarch found was Ferris Manis, Gene-sire of the 10th Legion. Manis was another Primarch whose gestation pod landed in the wilderness of a dangerous planet. Medusa is a waste world. Generations of industrial exploitation had made the surface unstable, and millennia of discarded industrial machinery and waste completed the picture of a gloomy and barely habitable planet. And to top it all off, before humanity ever even mastered agriculture, the war in heaven had reached Medusa, and remnants of the conflict between the Old Ones and the Necrons lay dormant in the few untouched areas of the planet. The pod carrying the child Primarch landed in one of these hidden places, and after he had spent some time growing up alone in the wilderness, Ferris grew curious and decided to examine the technology that had birthed him. While studying his pod, he accidentally freed an ancient biomechanical worm-like monster, which proceeded to leave the cave and began terrorizing the human population. Manis felt incredibly guilty and vowed to take the creature down, an oath that would take him years to complete, finally trapping the monster in a volcano and drowning it in lava, its living metal skin covering his arms, and finally giving him his name, Ferris Manis, Iron Hand. During his long hunt, Manis had shunned human contact, and he didn't become that much more personable afterwards. He did rejoin society and began teaching the nomadic clans of Medusa all about technology, but while he was made ruler, he was very hands-off, preferring that they handle their own conflicts if possible. This is how the Emperor found him, a stern ruler well-versed in technology who preferred action to words. Like his brother Leman Russ, Ferris refused to swear loyalty to the Emperor unless he was beaten in combat, and so the two fought a cataclysmic duel in the mountains of Medusa until Magnus was beaten and agreed to serve the master of mankind. Reunited with the legion made from his genes, Magnus quickly got to work shaping them into a force of relentless conquest. Renamed the Iron Hands after their leader, the 10th Legion was a force known for its armored advances and for showing no mercy to those who proved themselves too weak for the Emperor's vision of humanity. Ferris himself proved to be the most stalwart of his brothers, even more so than Rogal Dorne. Once Ferris had made a decision, there was no turning him from it, and he was loyal more than anything else. In battle, he was a sledgehammer, and his intuitive knowledge of warfare was second to none, a truth that even Horus would acknowledge later during the heresy, saying that none knew war better than himself except perhaps Ferris Manis. Given his stern demeanor, it probably won't surprise you to know that Magnus spent most of his time in his forge or in his planning rooms, and didn't form very many relationships at all, much less with his bickering brother Primarchs, with one exception. Fulgrim would form an unlikely and deeply important friendship with Ferris, the two complementing each other well despite their differences. The pair would forge weapons for each other, and their trust went deeper than almost any other pair among the other Primarchs, a fact that would become one of the greatest tragedies of the upcoming heresy. Fourth to be rediscovered was the Phoenician, the Primarch known as Fulgrim. At his best, he was a man who excelled at getting the most out of those he commanded, and had a great appreciation for the arts and the beautiful things humanity made. And it was the planet he landed on as a child that reinforced those traits, though, to be fair, it was more in spite of his surroundings rather than because of them. Deimos was yet another world ravaged by millennia of industrial activity, a trend that should be noticeable by now. Many of the worlds cut off from Terra during the Age of Strife had slowly run out of resources and lost knowledge in the intervening time. So when the pod-carrying baby Fulgrim landed in an abandoned factory district, his coming was like a miracle for the people living there. By the time he was 15, he had identified a number of places to increase the efficiency of his factory district, and was given a seat on the local council. By the time he was 50, he had become the ruler of the whole planet and had sparked a renaissance. Fulgrim was running the planet so well that the people of Deimos finally had free time, and so he had fostered in them the love of the arts. And this is how the Great Crusade found Deimos and Fulgrim. The huge Baroque warships of the Emperor's fleet entered orbit, dropships landed and disgorged hundreds of armored space marines, each wearing a work of art never before seen on Deimos. Fulgrim recognized the beauty of these works and the god who led this alien procession, and knelt immediately. Fulgrim, as it turned out, was the Primarch of the 3rd Legion, an army that had recently suffered a catastrophic accident that lost most of its gene seed, the material that lets a legion replace its losses. Fulgrim spoke so beautifully to his new sons that the Emperor himself was moved and allowed the legion to be named the Emperor's Children, taking the imperial eagle as their symbol, becoming heralds of sorts for the Emperor's forces. Fulgrim, for his part, took this as a great honor, and he pushed his new legion to become the very best that any Astartes had ever been. Perfection was the only goal, nothing less would do, and it was this drive to purge weakness that gained Fulgrim a strong friendship with his brother Ferris Manis, both Primarchs striving to embody the very best of the Emperor's vision for humanity. In combat, Fulgrim led his men with almost insane adherence to the ideals of efficiency and perfection, ensuring that objectives were won with the absolute minimal losses possible. For instance, when asked to take the world of Byzas, Fulgrim won the day using only 7 Marines, taking grievous wounds in the process. Unfortunately, the size of Fulgrim's legion would force the Emperor and Horus to hold them back from the biggest, most glorious campaigns, and so Fulgrim grew to be very hungry for approval, while still being so sure that he and his sons were the absolute pinnacles of the legions, a combination that would make him an easy mark for his less loyal brothers later. Continuing the theme of struggling through childhood on a hostile planet, Vulkan was discovered next. Frigid cold, dangerous monsters, and collapsing societies were one thing, but when Vulkan's pod opened to the blazing heat of the volcanic radiation-blasted world of Nocturne, it would be fair to say that he probably had to brave the most hostile conditions to start in. Vulkan was discovered quickly and raised by a local blacksmith. Even on a world like Nocturne, where the crust itself is barely holding together at the best of times, humanity still found a way to survive. That tenacity and the sense of community that supported it was something that young Vulkan took to heart. Within 3 years, the boy had already become a strong giant of a man, capable of great works of art in his adopted father's forge, but he was also a great leader, and in his 4th year, he got a chance to prove it. Being a death world where any life possible is harsh and often miserable, Nocturne was almost the perfect hunting grounds for the Drakari, the Dark Eldar, graceful and cruel alien slavers who delight in misery. Every 4 years, like clockwork, they raided Nocturne tribes, and every 4 years the humans living there would hide and hope not to be found. Until a young Vulkan stood in the center of the village, holding only his 2 blacksmithing hammers, wordlessly inspired his community to stand against the alien raiders, and for the first time in generations, the humans won, beating back the Drakari with a 4-year-old Primarch leading them. Fairly predictably, emissaries from the 7 largest villages on Nocturne had traveled to meet the miraculous child and swore to join him in defense of their world, and it was at the victory celebration that a stranger appeared. He arrived just as a tournament to honor the recent triumph was about to start, and he said he could beat anyone, including young Vulkan. 8 days of back and forth, the stranger and Vulkan each besting the other until the final challenge, a hunt for the largest salamander they could find. It would be more accurate to describe the gigantic lizards that wander Nocturne's lava fields as dragons rather than salamanders, but regardless, the largest kill would win the tournament, and the 2 set out. Vulkan had good luck finding a huge drake and slaying it, but on his journey back, the volcano he was hunting on erupted, hurling him off the edge of a cliff. He held on with one hand for hours, unwilling to drop his prize, but unable to haul both himself and the carcass up. That's when the stranger appeared, with a much bigger kill. Without hesitation, the stranger used his salamander as a bridge to cross the lava and get to Vulkan, hoisting the boy and his salamander up to safety, but sacrificing his own trophy. When the pair returned to the village, Vulkan was declared the winner, but he pledged his services to the stranger anyway, now revealed to be the Emperor, as any person willing to give up glory to save a life was worthy of his service. And just like that, Vulkan was reunited with his father and the 18th Legion, now renamed the Salamanders in honor of the trial that had won the Emperor his son's loyalty. The Salamanders were the second of the Trefoil legions we mentioned earlier, and while we do know why they were created, this is a story better left for our retelling of the Horus heresy. For now, it's enough to know that as a byproduct of their very special makeup, Vulkan and his gene sons were immovable in the defense of others. To be clear, this wasn't the stubbornness of the Iron Hands or Imperial Fists. The warriors of the 18th Legion were practical and not above falling back if the need arose. But if their charge was in danger, if civilians needed support, or if there was ever a need for a shield to hold an enemy in place as long as possible, the Salamanders stood ready. And this was reflected in the demeanor of their Primarch. Vulkan was a calm, wise, and steadfast man in most situations. He was kind to those he protected and ruthless against the enemies of humanity. Vulkan spent a few years learning from the Emperor before truly being reunited with his legion. As the youngest Primarch thus far to be found, Vulkan was truly a child and required training in the ways of war and statecraft, among other things. But soon his first engagements began. It was, of course, a rescue mission. Vulkan arrived to relieve the surviving members of his legion during a fierce battle at the head of 3,000 new recruits, just in time to win the day, but not in time to save many of his sons that he had never met. High casualties would mark the 18th Legion through the rest of the Great Crusade, with the army being used primarily for desperate holding actions and generally anywhere that the Imperial leadership needed to hold at all costs. This led to the Salamanders being by far the smallest of the Legion Astartes, so much so that when Roboute Guilliman wrote the new laws that broke up the legions into smaller chapters, the Salamanders were exempt as they were already at chapter strength. Regardless, they and their Primarch were always the first to dive into danger and the last to leave a hopeless defense. Unlike other Marines, the Salamanders often continued to live in the tribes of their birth with their mortal relatives, which only served to reinforce the bonds they had with unaltered humans. They never lost sight of who they were or what they were truly defending. Officially the 6th Primarch to be found, there's not much at all to say about the early life of Rogal Dorne. Either nothing of note happened, or the typically stoic man simply didn't go into much detail when asked. We do know that the pod bearing the Primarch of the 7th Legion landed on the world of Inwit, a planet tidally locked to a dying star, causing half the planet to be covered in scorching deserts and the other half to be covered in thick glaciers. And it's beneath these monolithic sheets of ice that people living on Inwit made their homes in fortresses carved from the ice itself. The child who would become Rogal Dorne was adopted into the House of Dorne, one of the ruling clans of the planet, and just like his brothers grew quickly and at a young age, he was already bigger, stronger, and smarter than anyone else. But he was a dutiful grandson to the patriarch of the Dorne clan, a man that Rogal would remember fondly for the rest of his life. That loyalty and lack of ego would mark Rogal's entire life. He was a man who was a capable and talented leader, but never showed a hint of ambition to take power. He was dour, serious, and unsmiling, though to those who knew him well, he apparently had a decent sense of humor. After his grandfather died, it was obvious who would succeed him, and Rogal was crowned the Emperor of the Inwit Cluster in very short order. A large part of his success was that Phalanx, an orbiting battle station built in the Dark Age of technology. The Phalanx had sat derelict in space for generations before Dorne repaired it, bolstering ancient systems and revealing a talent for building defenses and fortresses. But regardless of Dorne using a massive, powerful space fortress to build a functioning spacefaring empire from a grim and resource-poor world, the second Imperial ships translated into his system and he met the Emperor of Mankind, Dorne bent his knee and pledged loyalty. So yeah, out of all his brothers, Rogal Dorne was probably the one with the least personality. He never went against an order until after the heresy, but again, that's a story for later. He never showed ambition, barely even cracked a smile or made a joke, and the only demands he ever made were in the defense of Imperial law. He is even famously one of the only Primarchs with absolutely zero psychic ability, and perhaps that is where he was meant to be. Solid, steadfast, incorruptible, unquestioning. All these things he had and then some. The man couldn't even lie. He was also a very talented military mind. Most of his brothers considered him to be one of the very best that the Primarchs had to offer. He made well-ordered plans like Guilliman, he was as bold and fearless as the lion, and still made good use of moments of zeal in ways similar to Jagatai and Russ. It was well known amongst the Primarchs that if a fortress was held by Dorne and his legion, then it could not be taken. Dorne seems to be the first Primarch built to maintain the new Imperium rather than just taking more territory. But despite being a fairly boring man by most accounts, Dorne got along well with most of his brothers. Most. His inability to lie and his rigid adherence to Imperial law often got him on the bad side of just about every one of his more morally dubious brothers, none more so than Perturabo. Although a stiff breeze could bruise Perturabo's ego, he had a very special hatred for Dorne, as the two often competed for the title of Best Siege Master. Well, Perturabo competed, Dorne just did his job and kept coming out on top. Eventually, when the Emperor declared Horus Warmaster and left for Terra and his secret project, Dorne was the only Primarch to go with him. His father wanted him to bolster the Imperial Palace, and he transformed the Himalayan complex into one of the most impenetrable fortresses in the galaxy. And this is why the registered homeworld for the Imperial Fist is Holy Terra itself, with Rogal Dorne being named the Praetorian of Terra. The 7th Legion still claims Terra as its homeworld today, even though from the beginning the Legion was a fleet-based one, operating primarily out of the ancient battle station Phalanx. More than any of his brothers, Roboute Guilliman clearly had the easiest life. The pod carrying the Primarch of the 13th Legion lands on the temperate world of Macrog, a world built with a relatively well-developed society, loosely resembling the Romans of antiquity. He is then found not by slaves, criminals, or barbarian tribe members, but by the ruling elite of the planet. Guilliman hit the jackpot. The miraculous child from the stars is given the name Roboute Guilliman and adopted by one of the ruling consuls of Macrog. He is raised in relative luxury, given the best education and the best opportunities for growth. Like his brothers, Roboute grew quickly and by age 10 had command of his adopted father's armies, far outgrowing his tutors in every subject from philosophy to science to warcraft. But it's what he did with those armies that would give the best glimpse into what kind of a leader Guilliman had grown to be. Two incidents before his rediscovery show his character very clearly. The first is early on in his career. Not long after he was given command of his father's armies, the mountain regions to the north were home to a nomadic population of barbarians that had plagued the more settled regions of Macrogge for years. Young Roboute was tasked with finally destroying them, and at first he seemed to do that, taking their holy sites to force the smaller guerrilla forces of the barbarians to come to him rather than searching for ghosts in the mountains. Once he had drawn them out though, Guilliman called out for a duel with their leader rather than put both armies through more bloodshed. But the Primarch had a plan, and as the two warriors fought each other, it became very clear that the barbarian leader couldn't hope to match this preteen demigod. But Roboute never made a strike. He just parried over and over until the barbarian was exhausted and at his mercy. Then, instead of killing him, Roboute brought out an old religious artifact that his father's army had captured some time before and offered it freely. The Primarch won through diplomacy, bringing the mountain clans into the fold by example and kindness. But he was a Primarch still and was not opposed to being merciless when the moment called for it. Upon return from the mountain campaigns, Guilliman discovered that his father's co-consuls had assassinated him and started a coup. They didn't like the changes that Roboute and his adopted father were making to the Macroggan society, attempting to make it a meritocracy where birthright didn't mean as much as skill and passion. Needless to say, Roboute was not kind to these rebels. Oddly enough, it's at this moment that the Great Crusade had reached a nearby system and the Emperor began hearing about this prodigy on Macrogge. He knew immediately that this must be another missing Primarch, but a sudden warp storm kept him away from the system for 5 long years, and by the time it cleared and the Imperial forces contacted Guilliman, he had not only tamed Macrogge as its leader, but every nearby system he could reach. And that's really what Roboute was made to be, a superb general capable of running a complex campaign from individual squad tactics to supply lines and fallback options. But more than that, like his brother Rogal Dorne, Guilliman seemed to be made more for what comes after fighting, rather than just the fighting itself. Roboute was put in charge of his 13th Legion, the Ultramarines, and it was at the forefront of most campaigns in the remainder of the Crusade. In fact, aside from the Luna Wolves and their Primarch Horus, no other legion conquered more territory. Guilliman took whole sectors, then built up their infrastructure, ensuring these places could defend themselves and stood the best chance possible to become valuable parts of the Imperium. Guilliman was also one of the most liked of his brothers, not because he was particularly fun like Leman Russ, or because he was beautiful and charming like Sanguinius, but because he was generally calm, honest, and didn't play around when it came to getting the job done. And he was trusted by the Emperor and Horus, which was good because Guilliman's Ultramarines grew to be the largest legion by a wide margin by the end of the Great Crusade, swelling in numbers suspiciously around the same time the 2nd and 11th Legions mysteriously disappeared. One of the most psychically gifted of all the Emperor's sons, Magnus the Red's story is one that is made in equal parts of hubris and unearned consequence, but his early life almost rivaled the grandeur of Guilliman's. The pod holding the child that would become Magnus landed on Prospero, a far-flung colony of outcast psychers, mutants who were not welcome anywhere else. The pod came screaming in like a comet and smashed into the central plaza of Prospero's largest city. The boy emerged, fully conscious, and was adopted by the local scholars. And that bit about Magnus being conscious even as he emerged from his pod is important. He was such a powerful psyker that he remembered his whole existence, even his own birth. In fact, it wasn't long before Magnus was having conversations with the Emperor himself via the warp, long before they would ever meet. In this way, Magnus was probably the most prepared out of all his brothers to rejoin the Imperium when the Crusade arrived. In the meantime, though, Magnus set to work on Prospero, cleansing it of a parasitic infestation of psychic wasps and restoring the city of Tizca, which would become the new capital. Prospero was allowed to flourish in a way that no other colony of mutants could ever hope to in the Imperium or otherwise, and by the time the Emperor finally made it there, the planet stood ready to join the Imperium. Magnus and the Emperor formed a deep bond for the time they were together. Big E didn't exactly have many peers who could even come close to matching his psychic might, so having his newly found son with him on dives into the warp was a great experience. Think of it as the psychic equivalent of tossing a ball around in the backyard. But the Emperor had a big problem because he was really trying to push back the forces of the gods of chaos, and to do that, he decided the best idea was to give them as little oxygen as possible, which meant ignoring their existence to starve them of the attention they needed to gain power. and this meant that while Magnus was the most warp-gifted of his sons, he had to be very stern with him on many occasions. Magnus was not to investigate or dabble with creatures from the warp for any reason. And then he gave Magnus his legion, the 15th, the Thousand Sons, who were currently suffering from a large-scale mutation called the Flesh Change. Being made from Magnus's genetic material meant that his legion was also home to some of the most psychically active Marines in the Imperium, and without any guidance, they couldn't control their powers, even as they tried desperately to ignore them. Magnus and the Emperor worked tirelessly to find a solution, and in the end, Magnus sacrificed his eye in a bargain with the warp creatures to save his sons, and for a time, this stopped the mutations. Here's where things get frustratingly bad for Magnus. So every Primarch is made for a purpose, and it seems as though Magnus was made to be a fountain of psychic energy. He was more powerful than almost any other psyker in the galaxy at his height, and his curiosity to learn more so he could grow and gain control was a very predictable outcome of designing a being with this sort of power. Knowing all of this, the Emperor told him to just not poke at the warp and left it at that. He never really told him why. He never went into specifics. It's like telling a child not to touch an oven, but not that it will burn you if you do. And so, of course, Magnus kept researching and poking at the warp. The Imperium, though, was very superstitious about psychers and mutants in general, so even amongst his brothers, Magnus was viewed with suspicion, and in some cases, outright scorn. It didn't help that the further and further the Crusade got from Terra, the more strange creatures it came across, including many warp creatures that no one could identify. Demons weren't a known thing. Remember, the Emperor had strictly clamped down on that knowledge, so it was blamed on Magnus and his legion, with even the other Primarchs distrusting him due to his use of warp sorcery. But Magnus was determined to prove the usefulness of psychers in warfare when it was properly tempered, and he developed the Librarians, a special group of Space Marines who were sensitive to the warp and who could be trained to use their powers for the benefit of the Imperium. Librarians proved so effective that the practice soon spread to almost every legion, much to the anger of Primarchs like Mortarion and Leman Russ. The debate over the use of psychic powers grew so heated that eventually the Emperor was forced to call a special council to decide what to do, and on Nicaea, Magnus and his doctrine were put on trial. It was a difficult and lengthy process, with Primarchs and Marines from many legions weighing in on the pros and cons, but eventually the decision was made that the only psychers allowed in the legions would be the astropaths and navigators that are necessary for warp travel, and the Librarians would go back to being normal legionnaires, strictly hiding their psychic abilities. Magnus was unhappy with the decision, but he held it for a long time, even dissuading his brother Lorgar from secretly researching the secrets of the warp after the council had ruled. Of course, things were progressing now in a way that would leave Magnus very little choice but to use his might to help the Imperium, but that's a story for later. 10th to be found was Sanguinius, the literal golden child of the Imperium. The Primarch of the 9th Legion was perfect and is as close to a Gary Sue as possible in this lore. He was kind and compassionate while being strong and merciless against those who would do harm to humanity. He had powerful psychic gifts, including a strong ability to see the future like his brother Conrad Kurze, except he wouldn't be driven mad by it. He was a masterful combatant, a courageous and wise leader, a brilliant tactician, and beloved, or at least respected, by every one of his brothers. And yes, that is over the top, almost cartoonish so, but we should remember that the story of Warhammer 40k quite often drifts into the operatic, and Sanguinius is hardly the only character with outrageously blunt portrayals. We would argue that the inclusion of a perfect son was necessary in this larger-than-life story. The pod carrying Sanguinius crashed into the planet of Baal, a world that had suffered nuclear and chemical warfare throughout the Dark Age of technology, and as a result, the surface was a blasted and irradiated hellscape dominated by hordes of mutant tribes and a group of unstated humans who struggled to fight for what little resources still existed. These are the people who found the baby Primarch glowing and beautiful. Like his brothers, Sanguinius grew quickly and was taller and stronger than any of his tribe mates by his first year. Oh, and he also had grown wings. No one is sure if it was a quirk of the radiation on Baal or if the Emperor had designed him this way, but Sanguinius had grown an obvious, if beautiful, mutation, a pair of pure white wings that were strong enough to allow him to fly. That, plus his incredible psychic abilities, allowed Sanguinius to lead his tribe called the Blood to victory after victory against the mutants of Baal, and so he was able to secure a future for his found family, even if it was still harsh on the planet's surface. This is when the Emperor appeared, disguised himself as he has done several times, trying to gauge the character of his lost son. But Sanguinius had the gift of foresight because of course he did, and he had seen this stranger in his dreams, knowing who he really was. Sanguinius didn't challenge the Emperor, nor did he immediately bend the knee either. For the first time, a Primarch bargained with the master of mankind. Sanguinius knew what the Imperium was like and knew that his tribe mates would likely be called just in case of hidden mutations, so he set a condition of his service upon them being allowed to live, which the Emperor agreed to. Sanguinius then asked something that no other Primarch had: what would happen if he refused to join? To this, the Emperor gave probably the best answer possible. He said that wouldn't happen because Sanguinius was clearly a man who cared about protecting humanity. He had saved the people of the Blood, and now that he was being given a chance to save humans across the galaxy, there was no way he could pass that up. He was correct, and Sanguinius swore loyalty without further conversation. Baal was set up as his legion's new homeworld, and after a few years learning about Imperial life and warfare from both the Emperor and Horus, he was given control of his legion, the Revenant Legion as it was called at the time. The 9th Legion had basically devolved into a pack of wild killers at this point, scattered across dozens of campaigns, fighting wherever they could. They had all of Sanguinius's rage, but none of his control, and so upon meeting them for the first time, he instead made an oath to them. These men would no longer be honorless berserkers, they would have his leadership and his strength, and in return, he would share their fate. Redemption or damnation, the great angel would be with them, fighting to make them the greatest legion of them all. His passion and intensity drew his men to him eagerly, and with the help of his psychic abilities, the raging flaw in their blood was calmed. From then on, the Legion was known as the Blood Angels. At this point, you all must be thinking that it's hypocritical for the Imperium at large, just especially the other Primarchs, to have seen this obvious mutant with potent psychic powers and just universally chose to adore him, whereas Magnus and Conrad are just seething in the background. But as far as the lore shows, none of Sanguinius' brothers resented him until the heresy. Favoritism aside, Sanguinius never fell victim to his ego or believed himself superior to any of his brothers or even his own sons, and true to his word, the Blood Angels quickly became one of the most honorable and effective legions in the Imperial war machine. His friendship with his brothers grew deeper the whole while, especially Horus, who believed that Sanguinius should have been made warmaster instead of him. Sanguinius was the best of them and more like the Emperor than any of the Primarchs, he had said. What happened between those two later on is perhaps one of the most painful tragedies in this story. Possibly the greatest fighter of all the Primarchs, Lionel Johnson was found next on the heavily forested planet of Caliban. A pod bearing the mark of the First Legion crashed onto the cursed planet way too close to the Eye of Terror. This proximity to the largest open warp portal in the galaxy made Caliban a dangerous place, full of warp-tainted monsters. Even the forest itself seemed to have a malign intelligence. Here, the history books lose track of Johnson, as he had landed far away from any human habitation. Somehow, the boy spent a decade in that monster-filled jungle, something almost impossible for even a Primarch to do, but of course, like every one of his brothers, a brush with civilization was inevitable, and some local knights on a monster hunt came across the wild giant of a man and almost slew him out of fear, but their leader, a man named Luther, calmed the whole situation and convinced the boy to come back with them. From there, it's a very predictable story. Now given a name, Lionel Johnson grew quickly, outstripping all his tutors and instructors, rising through the ranks with Luther, who had become his very best friend. The people of Caliban were organized into fiefs ruled over by various knightly orders, very similar to the medieval Europe on Terra. Not long afterwards, Luther and Johnson had gained enough fame that they began to form a coalition of the knightly orders. They believed that altogether Caliban could be cleansed of the monsters that had terrorized its people for generations. Luther was a skilled orator, something that Johnson never really gained a taste for. Regardless, in a single decade, the entire planet was cleared and made safe for the people of Caliban, and Johnson, who had led the overall effort, was made Grand Master of his order. You can imagine that Luther was a little jealous of that, which is something that he never really got over. Johnson spent the following years gathering every other order under his banner until he ruled the planet, which is precisely when the Forward Scouts of the Great Crusade reached the Caliban system. It seems like Johnson didn't fight or challenge the Emperor when they met, which is a bit odd considering how audacious and proud he was at the time, but it could also be that Johnson simply recognized the Emperor as a superior being, or perhaps had some awareness of him already, like some of his brothers had. Either way, he was immediately placed in command of the First Legion, which was swiftly renamed the Dark Angels. The First Legion had been the Emperor's favorite tool for quite a long time, even after Horus was found, and so their leadership was actually very slow to accept their gene father. The Lion, however, was in no mood to accept any insubordination and dueled every company commander he could find, famously fighting a captain wearing Terminator armor while Johnson wore nothing but his usual clothes. It was the right move, and both sides gained respect for one another through the ritual. The same could not be said for the nobility of Caliban, who were scared of change. They attempted to assassinate both the Emperor and Johnson, but were soon after pacified. Unfortunately, this would not be the last time Johnson was forced to act against his own people, as resentment continued to grow while he made a name for himself and his legion on the crusade. In terms of his relationship with his brothers, most found Johnson irritating and full of himself, which he was. Mind you, he was also probably the best fighter of them all, and at one point openly fought his brother Leman Russ over a disrespectful slight during one of their campaigns. Lion was a loyal son, but he had ambition, pride, and was competitive by nature. That, coupled with his difficulty understanding the emotions of his brothers, led him to be liked only by a few and only in small doses. This would change with time, but for now, this is where we leave the first Primarch. A pod containing the Primarch of the 4th Legion streaks across the night sky of a distant world named Olympia, coming to rest in the mountains far from any human settlements. For a whole year, the child inside would be alone, and as he grows to his full gigantic height, he becomes known as an elusive wanderer who slays the dangerous beasts of the mountainside wilderness. While engaging in some curiosity, the boy is found by guards of a nearby city and taken to the local tyrant. This man immediately understood that the boy was more than a normal human. Being taller than a full-grown man at 1 year old was likely a bit of a giveaway. He adopted the boy and made every attempt to show him love and affection, something that the Primarch would never reciprocate. He chose for himself the name Perturabo and refused to grow close to anyone except his adopted sister. Perturabo was interested only in excellence, efficiency, and cold logic. He led his father's armies in subjugation of the other fortified cities of Olympia, but only because he wanted experience with siegecraft, something that he would indeed become known for. This was the man that the Emperor found when his crusade reached Olympia. Perturabo tossed aside his adopted family easily and took up his new legion of super soldiers made with his genetic material. He named them the Iron Warriors, and he was just as ruthless with them as he was with his enemies. After looking over their war record, Perturabo decided that his Marines were lacking in many areas and punished them by ordering decimation. 1 in every 10 legionnaires were chosen by lottery and beaten to death by his squad mates, and he ordered this more than once in the coming decades whenever his Marines failed to hold up to his exacting standards. And so he became known for many of the negative traits rather than his talents. In fact, we are of the opinion that no Primarch squandered their gifts quite like Perturabo did. The Lord of the 4th Legion was even more of a genius than most of his brothers, able to understand the workings of any machine by simply studying it for a while. He was able to think so quickly and at such large scales that he had a computer grafted into his skull to handle some of the more mundane tasks and calculations involved in managing a battle. But all of that couldn't help him overcome his greatest enemy, himself. Perturabo was self-important, petty, and jealous. His great mind was often turned to how unfairly he believed he was being treated. His brother Rogal Dorne, for instance, was given some of the most glorious campaigns and was trusted to build the fortifications on Holy Terra itself, while Perturabo's legion was given the most thankless and grueling sieges imaginable, taking tremendous losses over and over again. To his credit, Perturabo may have complained and whined like a petulant teenager, but he did his job and he did it well, and for the most part his stoic nature kept all the whining internal, but that sort of brooding poisons even a Primarch's mind over time. This bitterness led him to make foolish mistakes and quarrel with his brothers when he didn't have to. It also made him a very easy target for later heresy, although that's a story for later. Mortarion of the 14th Legion is an interesting case. Uncompromising, grim, relentless, but also angry and bitter. He is a Primarch forged by hardship, and is one of the very few cases of an eventual traitor who could possibly have remained loyal were it not for the pressures and calamities that struck him and his legion. In the beginning, the boy who would be Mortarion crashed onto a poisonous world called Barbarous, directly onto the remains of a recent and cataclysmic battle. The victorious alien warlord suddenly heard the cries of a child echoing across the battlefield and was surprised to find a human-looking boy. Barbarous is choked with poisonous fog that rests thicker and thicker the higher one travels into the mountains. Doesn't have much effect on the alien warlords who ruled this planet, but for humans, even a Primarch, it was very toxic. Luckily, the child was stronger than a normal human, and so could survive a little bit of the poison, and so the warlord named him Mortarion and kept him in a private villa on the mountainside as a sort of pet. Mortarion grew like his brothers had, with the warlord teaching him everything he knew about fighting and leading armies. He would take the child with him on campaigns against other warlords, and Mortarion learned quickly, but he was not grateful to his adopted father. Mortarion saw that the warlord was not human, and knew that his own people lived below the poisonous fog. He also knew that the warlord was afraid of him, having built his own home much higher in the mountains, in such thick fog that even Mortarion couldn't breathe. So he escaped, climbing down to the human villages to see what his people were like. He found frightened, superstitious people who were constantly under attack from alien warlords, using warp magics and strange technology. By now, of course, Mortarion himself looked a bit like a monster. He had come from inside the fog that no human could survive, and he was monstrously huge compared to them. But eventually, as he helped with harvests and made himself useful, the humans began to trust him. And that's when a minor warlord attacked. The gigantic Primarch grabbed a two-handed scythe and destroyed the attacking army, chasing the surprised alien leader into the fog and killing him to the cheers of the human villagers. And so a peasant uprising began. Mortarion taught them how to fight, taught their blacksmiths how to make weapons instead of farm tools, and made crude respirators for his new army, his Death Guard. When the next alien army attacked, he seized the initiative and charged up the mountain with his army, and together they began to take out the aliens one by one. This time, fighting in the fog strengthened humans and Primarch alike, and on the eve of the final battle with Mortarion's adopted father, a stranger arrived. You all know where this is going by now. It was the Emperor, though Mortarion didn't know. He challenged the Primarch to take his former father's fortress alone, on the condition that if he failed, he would swear loyalty to the stranger. Mortarion was proud and would not back down, even though being so high up meant almost certain death, but up he went. Predictably, it did not go well for him, as the hoses on his breathing apparatus melted and he passed out. The stranger stepped in, saving him and revealing himself to be the Emperor at the same time, and Mortarion, true to his word, pledged himself. He was given the 14th Legion, the Dusk Raiders, who he renamed the Death Guard after his brave army of peasants. Recruiting from Barbarous meant that the 14th Legion became known for relentless assaults and uncompromising advances. Whenever there was an enemy that was too tough to break, Mortarion and his Death Guard were called in and simply walked forwards until they ceased to be a problem. Humorless and strict, Mortarion didn't make friends amongst his brothers, either being enraged by their use of psychic powers like he was with Magnus, or accusing others of being too soft thanks to having a more luxurious upbringing like Guilliman. He grew bitter, like Perturabo did, about getting the most thankless assignments, but he did grow very close to Horus during his time in the Crusade, a relationship that would lead to his downfall. Okay, look, no one likes him, but we have to talk about Lorgar. This guy is really the whole reason the Horus Heresy even happens. There are factors involved with him turning to the dark powers of chaos, but at the end of the day, Lorgar is the first heretic. The pod holding the child that would become Lorgar Aurelian crashed into the deserts of the planet Colchis, and was found quickly thereafter by a band of nomads who recognized that this child was something special, and they weren't the only ones. A wandering priest named Corferon also immediately recognized that this 17-day-old child the size of a 10-year-old was clearly more than human, and after convincing the boy to come with him, Corferon slaughtered the nomads to keep Lorgar a secret. The boy was then raised in a harsh, religiously strict environment, and it was here that the first bit of poison worked its way into Lorgar's character. It seemed the boy had a natural draw to faith and to the fervor that comes from truly believing in a cause. Had he been raised on Terra, this might have translated into a strong adherence to the imperial truth, but instead he took on the religion of his mentor, and Corferon worshipped the primordial truth, one of the many names for chaos. He physically and mentally abused the boy, ensuring that Lorgar was loyal to him alone and pushing the extraordinary youth to seek a leadership position. Corferon knew Lorgar had what it took to rule the whole planet, and he wanted to control the next ruler of Colchis. As Lorgar grew more powerful, his psychic abilities began manifesting. He began dreaming of a golden armored giant and a cyclops in blue robes coming to Colchis. He interpreted this as the return of the primordial truth, but really, he was seeing his brother Magnus and the Emperor in a prophetic dream. Regardless of the truth, this was too much for the established religious rulers of the planet. They declared Lorgar a heretic, which is ironic in hindsight, and attempted to arrest him. But Lorgar had not only become a fully grown Primarch, but he had many devout followers, and within the next 6 or so years, Lorgar was the undisputed ruler of a fanatically loyal planet. And then finally his dream came true, and the Emperor arrived with Magnus at his side. Lorgar, of course, had been waiting for this and gladly pledged his loyalty to his true father. The worship on Colchis changed overnight to worship of the Emperor, something he did not agree with at all, but Lorgar was new and he indulged his son for now. Lorgar was given the 17th Legion, the Imperial Heralds, now renamed the Wordbearers after Lorgar himself, and the title he had gained while purging the unfaithful of Colchis. It is clear that Lorgar was originally meant to be that zealous face of the Imperium, the first thing the enemies of humanity would see, and they acted in that way for many years of the fighting in the Crusade. But Lorgar would not stop worshipping his father as a god, and this led to the first real signs of trouble. Wherever the Wordbearers went, on every world they conquered, they erected a cathedral to the Emperor. They made the office of the chaplains religious leaders for the Space Marines that would eventually be adopted by every legion, and not only was the Emperor displeased with the slow progress of the 17th Legion as they kept pausing to establish these churches, but the Emperor was disgusted with the religion. Space Marines are for battle, not faith, he told Lorgar, and demanded he stop. When the Wordbearers continued, more drastic measures were taken. It was even rumored that the Emperor almost used the Space Wolves to remove the Wordbearers from history, like the 2nd and 11th Legions had been. But some of the other Primarchs, likely his brother Magnus, who had formed a close relationship with Lorgar, begged for a lighter sentence. So the Emperor ordered the Ultramarines and their Primarch Roboute Guilliman to come with him to Lorgar's perfect capital city of Monarchia and raze it to the ground as Lorgar was forced to watch. That was the last straw. It was too much, and it was while the Primarch mourned his city and the loss of his faith that his old mentor, Corferon, came to him and reminded him of more worthy beings to worship. From there, plans began to be written while Lorgar and the Wordbearers pretended to be model Imperial soldiers, and the snowball began to slowly roll downhill. The Horus heresy had begun. The Great Khan is a strange case amongst his brothers, not because of any particular quirk or cartoonish failing, but because there's nothing really strange about the man, aside from him being a genetically modified superhuman demigod, of course. Jagatai landed on a planet called Chogoris, or Mundus Planus if you're an Imperial surveyor. This planet is almost a paradise, wide-sweeping plains of green grass, gorgeous mountains, and deep blue oceans. The people living there were loosely organized into nomadic tribes, relying on their horses to hunt and travel. There was, of course, conflict between the tribes, raiding and slavery were common, and larger tribes formed empires that ruled large areas of the plains. Jagatai was found by a smaller tribe and spent most of his early years doing what every other tribesperson was doing, fighting and hunting. But just like with his brothers, his quick growth and effortless excellence marked him out as different, and many of the local tribes came to revere him as a gift from the gods. The biggest thing that made Jagatai different was that he was totally disinterested in fighting, or rather, it might be more accurate to say that he was much more interested in what happens after the fighting, in the future that could be won by fighting, and that mentality wasn't just rare among the tribes of Chogoris, but among his brothers as well. At some point, his adopted father was killed in a raid from another tribe in the area. Jagatai might have been a man of peace, but he was still a Primarch and would not allow this attack to go unanswered. Gathering what warriors he could, the young Jagatai found the offenders and wiped them out wholesale. Afterwards, Jagatai seemed to have come to a realization that he was feeding into the same cycle of violence and revenge, and so he swore that he would end the fighting and unite the tribes under one banner. Now, it took him over a couple of decades, but he did eventually conquer every settlement and tribe, absorbing them into his horde. And he mostly succeeded by relying on fast-moving light cavalry. He would attack and withdraw, fading into deserts and open plains to avoid counterattacks, while baiting his opponents into chasing him. Many of his brothers would later criticize Jagatai for these dishonorable tactics, but the Khan rarely lost and often took down forces many times his size. He was also a very practical man, and when the Emperor landed on Chogoris, he recognized him for what he was, a powerful human warlord who could help him unite his people across the stars. He pledged his loyalty immediately. Jagatai was the Primarch of the 5th Legion, the Star Hunters. Luckily for him, these Marines already fought in a way that he was used to, being used primarily as scouts and fast-strike forces. What they lacked was a sense of self, and Jagatai saw to that immediately. Remember, he was a man who thought about what happens after the fighting is over, and he firmly believed that if a warrior didn't have a peaceful way to express themselves, it could lead to disaster. And so he encouraged his sons to take up the arts, writing, painting, music, anything to help them grow and experience culture. He was proven to be very correct in this, as just like the Iron Warriors, the 5th Legion, newly renamed the White Scars, were often given the most grueling, thankless missions. Scouting and hunting elusive enemies across the stars was hardly glorious and took a long time to finish, but they never gave up on a hunt, and unlike their Iron Warrior brothers, they never grew bitter or resentful because they had more in their lives than just moving from one mission to the next. If only all the Khan's brothers were so level-headed. Nostromo, a planet in perpetual night, was rich in adamantium and the suffering that comes with large-scale mining operations. The weakened and overmined surface was barely able to hold up most buildings, let alone a pod screaming in from the polluted upper atmosphere. A pod marked with the number 8, slammed straight through the upper crust of Nostromo, deep into the heart of the planet. Down that far, the only things around were people conscripted into mining adamantium and the wild animals that had adapted to living in the urban conditions. Unlike his brothers, nobody ever adopted Conrad. No one ever found this miracle child and took him in to raise him, and so he grew up feral, hunting wildlife for food and observing what he could of the humans around him. Everyone born on Nostromo had never seen sunlight, and those living at the lowest depths couldn't even afford artificial light, and so they had adapted to living in total darkness. But Conrad was a Primarch and could see everything. Extreme poverty is what breeds crime, and injustice was everywhere. The young Conrad may not have been taught by anyone, but he knew enough to know that hurting someone is wrong, taking their things is wrong, and as he grew, so too did his understanding of those concepts. Nostromo was a capitalist oligarchy. The planetary rulers were all wealthy mine owners or industrial leaders, and they were corrupt to the very core. Whatever flimsy pretense the planet had for a justice system was of course rigged to only ever affect the poor and never the rich. Kurze saw this and had the power to change it. Petty criminals started to be found dismembered on the streets, then prominent leaders and corrupt officials would be found hanged and disemboweled. Crime began to rapidly disappear as mothers warned their children to behave lest the Night Hunter find them. The nickname stuck. In fact, Conrad felt it was a more fitting name than any else he had received. Eventually, as crime in his city completely ebbed away, the Night Hunter revealed himself to the people and took his place as the monarch of Quintus. He even allowed himself some hope that his planet could be saved. He used his new power to gather knowledge, learning everything he could about as many subjects as possible. He led fairly and justly, even becoming known for his patience. But then, the nightmares would start. Like many other Primarchs, Conrad was a very psychically gifted man, and his particular abilities involved foresight. But he was plagued with visions of a dark and terrifying future, including his own death, since he was very young, and whenever he would seem to be getting a hold of himself, he would have another seizure, see the end, and go hunting for criminals. This, of course, is the problem with believing oneself to be the arbiter of right and wrong. Eventually, you will lose sight of yourself and become a monster that uses fear rather than compassion to gain respect. It was this sort of man that met the Emperor, Fulgrim, Ferris Manis, Rogal Dorne, and Lorgar when the crusade reached Nostromo. The Emperor told Conrad that he was here to take him home, but Kurze replied that he was the Night Haunter and had already seen what the Emperor would do to him. Nonetheless, he did pledge his loyalty, knowing how inevitable his visions often were, and was given his legion, the 8th Legion, which he named the Night Lords. The biggest problem with this was that the 8th Legion had been formed from prisoners on Terra, and we all know how Conrad felt about criminals. He attempted to recruit new Marines from only the finest, most upstanding people on Nostromo, but in a scheme to pay less taxes, the wealthy folks tricked him into taking more prisoners instead. It was some time before the Night Haunter noticed, as he was swiftly put to work as the Emperor's personal enforcer. He could see as well as anyone that Conrad's need for justice meant he would do anything to destroy criminality wherever it was, and so the 8th Legion swiftly became known for fighting campaigns against rebels, heretics, and dissenters. A Space Marine is a superhuman soldier, a mountain of muscle, wrapped in the finest armor available. They were easily a match for any of humanity's worst nightmares, and so whenever a community decided that they weren't going to pay the Imperial tithe, or didn't want to join the Imperium at all, the 8th was sent in to scare them straight. Eventually, of course, the other Primarchs found out that Conrad and his Night Lords were fighting terror campaigns against mostly civilian populations and demanded he be censured, which he was. The betrayer he felt as the Emperor had berated him for doing as in his mind he had been told was immense. And then to make matters worse, he discovered the trick played on him by the Nostroman nobility and believed neither his world nor his legion could be saved, and all through this his nightmares kept getting worse and worse. Kurze wasn't a soldier, he wasn't a general, a leader, or a king. He was a killer, with all the powers of a demigod, and even though he had moments where he was able to act like his noble brothers, he ultimately was never able to outrun his nightmares. In the lead up to the Horus heresy, Conrad began to really deteriorate, and while we have attempted to keep any comments on that story for our next discussion, it shouldn't come as any surprise that the Night Haunter eventually gave in to his demons and turned against the Emperor. Continuing the train of abused and abandoned sons, we have Angron the Red Angel. Like his brother Conrad, Angron never knew peace, even from the very start. The 12th Legion's Primarch landed in the cold mountains of a planet called Nucaria, surviving on his own for a short while before he was attacked by what was likely a troop of Aldari who had foreseen what the boy would become and attempted to stop him before he grew any more powerful. Angron was found after the fighting, badly wounded and surrounded by alien corpses. The people who found him were not saviors, however, but slavers, who saw this boy as an opportunity to make some money. Angron was sold into the gladiatorial fight pits and was put to work butchering other people for the crowd. During this time, his only positive influences were his fellow gladiators who trained him and gave him companionship. As he swiftly grew like all his brothers had, Angron became a crowd favorite and beat anything his masters would throw at him until he was ordered to fight his mentor. Angron flatly refused to harm the man who had been most like a father to him, and so he was given surgery to install a device called the Butcher's Nails. The nails are a type of passive lobotomy. Probes are inserted into the parts of the brain responsible for rage and attached to powered cables that bear a resemblance to dreadlocks. Slowly, these probes amplify the aggression of the victim until their brain can't take the damage anymore and they expire. The nails did their job, sending Angron into a blind fury, and when he awoke, he was surrounded by the cheering crowd while his adopted father lay dead at his feet in the sands of the fight pit. Angron broke then, and with the nails burning into his thoughts, he led a slave revolt, breaking out of the pits and gathering as many gladiators as he could before fleeing into the mountains like a 30k version of Spartacus. They lived there for years, fending off attacks from his former masters, but eventually starvation took its toll, and Angron prepared to die in one last glorious fight with what remained of his gladiator family. In the middle of this final fight, a shimmering teleportation field brought the Emperor himself. He had seen one of his lost sons close to death and had come to save him. "Come with me," he said, "and you will have a legion of soldiers, a long life spent waging war and perfecting your skills." Angron said no, so the Emperor returned to his ship and teleported him anyway. Angron was forced to watch as his family fought to the last without him, and he raged at the Emperor, forcing the Master of Mankind to pin him in place with his mind. Angron asked why he hadn't saved his gladiators, and the Emperor said he had his sights on bigger things. Angron despaired, saying that he was meant to die with them on Nucaria, and that only a ghost remained. The Emperor said that a ghost would suffice. Never has the Emperor's cruelty and ruthlessness been on display more than with Angron. The Red Angel was just the first to discover that the Primarchs were not his sons at all, they were simply his favorite tools. Raging and powerless to change his fate, Angron spent months in his new battle barge, killing any space marine from his legion who came to talk to him. The 8th Legion were the Warhounds, an efficient and brutal assault legion with a strong history of success. Regardless, Angron didn't want them and took a man named Karn, the captain of the 8th Company, to calm him down by letting the Primarch talk about his fellow gladiators and their traditions, a rare moment of compassion that would not last. Angron renamed his legion the World Eaters and set about putting his sons through more and more dangerous situations to prove their worthiness. Every time he would challenge them, and every time it wasn't enough. Angron was bitter, and the nails were also slowly killing him. Primarch though he was, nothing could be done to remove them, or so the Emperor claimed, but Angron's advanced physiology made it slow and very painful. Eventually, his sons began making their own versions of the nails in an attempt to show solidarity with their Primarch, but all it did was make him hate them even more. Corvus Corax has a story that somewhat mirrors his brother Conrad. The pod of the 19th Legion's Primarch came to rest on the airless moon of Lycaeus, a mineral mine used to feed the factories of the Forge world it orbited. Like Nostromo, Lycaeus was populated by the poorest and most powerful of the population: criminals, political dissidents, workers who had not met their quotas on the planet below, but instead of turning on each other, these people managed to form a loose community, and when the pod holding the infant Corax was found by a slave girl, they believed their savior had come. Hiding the child from the guards, the people of Lycaeus raised the boy, and he grew supernaturally fast, just like his brothers had. The people forced to work the mines came from all walks of life, so Corax was taught about philosophy, politics, demolitions, guerrilla warfare. Hell, he probably knew how to cook by the time he was fully grown. Raised to be a leader, the young Primarch got to work planning a rebellion. He organized people into combat squads disguised as work teams, forged his own weapons in concealed dugouts, and hid them across the moon. Then he started ordering small attacks to boost recruitment and begin weakening the establishment forces, hitting multiple places to spread out the already thinning garrisons of guards. Once morale was weakened just enough, he ordered the real attack. His forces overran security checkpoints and control bunkers, taking the moon very quickly, but of course, this was hardly his end game because he knew the tech guilds on the Forge world below would strike back at the rebels living on Lycaeus, and when they did, he was ready. Forces from the planet didn't know the moon like the miners did, and at every turn the soldiers were outmaneuvered and destroyed by the rebels. Finally, while they were busily trying to sweep the mines, Corax sidestepped the planetary forces and sent a nuclear charge to each of the 5 major cities on the Forge world using the supply routes that used to bring minerals down from the moon. With the major power bases for the establishment destroyed, the rebellion spread on the planet itself, and the moon was renamed Deliverance in honor of Corax's victory. This is precisely when the Emperor showed up, impressed with his son's ability to do so much with such little support. Corax agreed to join his father on the condition that he help the rebels stabilize the Forge world, which was now in chaos below. He agreed, of course. This wasn't a request from Angron after all, and called for the Mechanicus to take control of the factories to bring imperial order to the planet. Corax was given the 19th Legion, which he renamed the Raven Guard. Unfortunately, the master of the 19th was not pleased with what he saw. Before his rule, the 19th Legion was a sabotage specialist legion. They operated stealthily and raided rather than fighting battles outright. That part was to Corax's liking, but the 19th also engaged in terror tactics like their brothers in the 8th Legion did, and Corax did not want to become the Night Haunter. So he restructured, ensured his legion would only take missions that involved attacking forces with superior numbers in the defense of civilian populations, and never against them. Very swiftly, he became known as a reliable guerrilla commander, and was generally more liked than Conrad ever was. Mind you, Corax and Horus never ended up getting along, but considering how things worked out, that's probably for the best. A shadowy cell in the deepest, darkest part of the dungeons under the Imperial Palace reads Subject 11. Alright, we've kept you waiting this whole time, but now we can finally finish the story of the 20th Primarch and the history of Omegon. Unfortunately, the secrecy is still a large part of their story, as there is no record of the world where Omegon's pod crash landed. What we do know is that thanks to his soul being shared with his twin Alpharius, Omegon came to understand his nature a lot sooner than most of his brothers, barring Magnus, of course. With this understanding, the young Primarch assaulted some pirates, stole their ship, and took off towards Imperial space. At the same time, Alpharius was leading his Ghost Legion further and further ahead of the main crusade, working to soften targets for the other legions, of course, but also to search for his brother. It's unclear if the Emperor even knew that Alpharius Omegon was actually a set of twins, as it could have happened when the Chaos Gods stole them away, but they always acted as though he didn't know, so perhaps it's the truth. Regardless, at some point Alpharius finally learned where his twin was, and taking just a squad of his legionnaires with him, went off to find Omegon. The pair immediately recognized each other and presumably started finishing each other's sentences. They talked and agreed that now was the time to reveal themselves to the Imperium and their brothers. Remember, at this point, no one but the Emperor and his advisor Malcador knew Alpharius existed. He had been disguising himself as a normal Space Marine general the entire time. So the two of them planned out exactly how the encounter would go so that it looked as natural as possible. Omegon had built up a little coalition of space pirates or something of that sort, and so, pretending to be the one and only long-lost 20th Primarch, he attacked a Luna Wolf's forward element, trapping the big Imperial warships with just a few tiny fighters. Once Horus stepped in his own flagship, Omegon boarded and killed his way to the bridge before Horus stopped him. Recognizing another Primarch instantly, the Warmaster stood his men down and declared that the last Primarch had been found. As for his name, when Horus asked, Omegon simply said, "I am Alpharius." The plan had worked brilliantly, and Omegon continued to play the part of Alpharius for a few months, building a bond with Horus before finally meeting the Emperor, who must have thought Alpharius was enjoying some sort of joke. Regardless, the 20th Legion was renamed the Alpha Legion, and off they went to finish the Great Crusade. Now, not all the other Primarchs liked Alpharius. Both he and Omegon were skilled communicators, and they had a love of philosophy, but they always seemed to irritate their brothers slightly. Guilliman especially was very vocal about how much he disliked the way the Alpha Legion fought, to his eyes completely disorganized and making use of non-Astartes operatives. This stung Alpharius, as he believed his way of warfare was every bit as effective as Guilliman's rigid organizations and battle plans. So he pushed his legion harder and harder, making more convoluted battle plans and using loose formations and cells of his marines to weaken an enemy long before the main army ever reached them. Alpharius and Omegon may have been latecomers to the Crusades, but they performed some of the most masterful executions of enemy forces out of any legion. The Alpha Legion was also the last of the 3 Trefoil legions we mentioned previously, and their special purpose could not be more clear. Designed to be independent thinkers and to have small numbers so as to force them to adapt and use human operatives to supplement their forces, the Alpha Legion was always meant to be the spies of the Legiones Astartes. And so even when things began to fall apart and their brothers began picking sides, Alpharius and Omegon kept their cool and began making plans. They would ensure that humanity would survive. Thank you all so much for coming along with our exploration into the origins of the Emperor's sons. It is not an exaggeration to say that this part of 40K's lore has become the most expansive and developed, covering stories of amazing and not so amazing quality. The Black Library has published over 50 main novels in the Horus Heresy series alone, with more books covering other aspects, including one for each Primarch on their own. For our part, it felt right to put out this brief introduction of each Primarch before diving into the story of their downfall, so we hope you enjoyed this discussion because the conclusion is on its way. Just be sure to subscribe and ring that bell so that you don't miss the next More Lore.